So we couldn't have a conference on climate change and cultural heritage at the Smithsonian Institution without sharing the perspective of the museum community and museum institutions. And so for our final presentation, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Nicole Heller, who's going to speak on the topic of museums and collections and climate change. Nicole is a curator of the Anthropocene studies at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. Her primary research is concerned with sustaining biodiversity in the face of global change associated with the Anthropocene. For 15 years, she has worked at the interface between research and practice to pioneer climate change adaptation and mitigation in urban ecosystems, parks, and wildlands. And her secondary research practice is about environmental science communication. Extremely timely for today, Nicole. And so please welcome to the stage Nicole Heller.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me here today. It's really my honor and pleasure and quite humbling to be in the company of such amazing speakers and really powerful storytellers. I have the great honor to talk about the museum sector as well. I'm fairly new to this sector, but I'm so excited to be a part of it. So I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit about my own kind of journey in this climate change learning ecosystem. Actually, my first job out of college was translating the 1995 IPCC assessments for journalists. So I'm trained as an ecologist and evolutionary biologist. And that was the first kind of welcome to the first job, and it was a good one, and it really set my whole career kind of thinking about climate change and trying to find my own kind of path through this challenging topic. So I eventually went to graduate school and worked on studying my real passion, which is animal behavior, and I studied ants, actually. Spent a lot of time studying ants, and ants there's some similarities with people, actually. So I have thought a lot about social behavior. But in that work, I really, again, as doing that work, it really became climate was the central thing, because climate change was restructuring how ecosystems were and ant behavior and which ants could succeed where. And so kind of all signals kept leading me back to climate change. I then went and worked with some media organizations, Climate Central, on kind of climate storytelling and climate media, and trying to make that as science-based as possible, which eventually led me then into the world of practical climate-smart adaptation projects and conservation work out in California. And that was really powerful to think about how we can do conservation practice, so natural lands management, or really any kind of conservation in a way that was truly addressing the climate challenge, but also kind of a multiple benefits, really adapting us to the many different kinds of changes that are happening in our communities, which is under that idea of the Anthropocene. So I was fortunate enough then to be recruited to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History as the first curator of Anthropocene studies in the world. And this is, something I felt a little bit of ambiguity about. What is the Anthropocene really about? It's sort of this big word that can be kind of off-putting. But really, I find it a very useful keyword, a cultural keyword that I think brings us all together to think about what does this mean to be living in these times when human activities collectively are really damaging the planet. And so I think about Anthropocene studies very much as not about describing the impacts, as we've been talking about, and I think we're all pretty well versed in, but really how are we going to respond? And what are these new stories we're going to tell to build a beautiful and just and sustainable world? And I'm really excited to be here today because often in this climate communication journey, this climate science journey, I feel like there's been a lot of pressure on scientists to kind of represent this set of work. And I've been at numerous meetings where at the end someone will say, okay, what are you going to do? What are the scientists going to do? And I think, well, wait a second. This isn't my problem. It's what are we going to do? What are all of us going to do? And so I feel so excited and hopeful in the face of everyone sort of getting involved in this, and really this kind of all hands on deck moment that I hear being described so well here today, that everyone has a part of this story. And from whether adaptation to mitigation, we're all involved in this. And I think that's what's necessary to build a real social movement, a movement with solidarity to accomplish this task. I think it's essential to say one of the misnomers out there, and one of the things we can all sort of take to heart, is when you're facing this concept with your institution, you might be questioned by certain people. Well, isn't that a little controversial? You know, is this something that you really want to talk about? And it's so essential that we all feel completely grounded, and that this isn't controversial. This science is not controversial. Compared to other topics, there is greater consensus among scientists on this than probably almost anything else. The heroic efforts of thousands of scientists from around the world that have come together year after year to do these international assessments and review the science. There's been a level of scrutiny that's probably unparalleled to any other field. And so it's really essential to kind of feel grounded in the idea that the science is not controversial. What is controversial, perhaps, is how we respond. But again, that's not really so the science isn't what we should be talking about. And in many ways, I think of the science as really the context for these discussions, but really where we need to be talking with our communities, be working with our communities, be responding in our practices is moving beyond the science. And so this is another graphic. We saw this kind of earlier about the extreme heat that we've been feeling, and the warming each year kind of being another record warming year compared to the last that we have on record, which would be relative to since 1895 about. And so these trends are continuing each year as kind of beating the next for being the warmest. And as I think about this challenge, and as a scientist, and what I really promote amongst my colleagues, is to really think about this as an integrated, to not just think about the science and the sort of technical problems of fixing this, but to reach beyond and really see the opportunity we have here to build the kind of future we want to live in, and to use climate as a catalyst for impacting the kinds of changes, more broad-scale changes. So I show this quote here from Naomi Klein, which I find very kind of synthesizes it really well. She says, "I am convinced that climate change represents a historic opportunity on an even greater scale. As a part of getting our emissions down, we have the chance to advance policies that dramatically improve lives, close the gap between rich and poor, create huge numbers of good jobs, and reinvigorate democracy from the ground up." This is one way of looking at it. There are so many ways to see the way that this adaptation or responding to climate change is an opportunity. And it's important, vitally important, to see the loss that's been spoken to so eloquently earlier and to grieve that loss. But really what we have to do is kind of reframe this story as a story of opportunity. And when I use adaptation here, I mean it to involve mitigation as well. Because honestly, if we just adapt that and don't reduce fossil fuel emissions or other greenhouse gases, that's, in a way, we could consider that maladaptation, right? Because we're not really affecting the problem. So this is really this culture shift, right, that's going to shift our whole society to find a thriving Earth future and a just future for humans and non-humans alike. So as I think about kind of this audience, and many of us, we all come probably from different areas and different museums and different fields, and And that is the beauty of this problem, is that every field is connected to it. It's not, there's no way that this is a siloed issue. And in fact, we kind of have to reach beyond our disciplines, beyond our specialties, and really become interconnected thinkers. So every field is connected. The science is unequivocal, as I said earlier. And this is a social, cultural challenge, as our speakers also during the day have emphasized again and again. So as I look at this, every museum, every collection provides its own authentic and relevant way to engage this issue. And I think this is a really critical thing that I'm going to kind of continue to talk about it, is that there can be this thing out there called climate fatigue, right? If we keep talking about this problem in the same way, people start to kind of close their ears to it. And I think the cultural sector has a real opportunity to tell an authentic, unique story and to find really curious and interesting ways in with communities. So there are many strategies of engagement, but I was trying to kind of pull out a few that I wanted to emphasize as you think about your museum or your collection in the face of this challenge. And it's essential that we communicate clearly about the science and about what's going on, and don't let people's misinformation kind of bully us into not believing what we know is true. To be authentic, to find new partners, kind of reaching beyond your normal practices to invent new practices. Don't get stuck in the gloom and doom of the problem. Make connections, and this is where the Anthropocene is a really interesting keyword and bit of scholarship to study, is really thinking about this kind of global, local connections, the past, the present, and the future. These are all aspects of the storytelling we can do, as well as this intersectional aspect, that this has to be about social justice, kind of hand in hand with environmental sustainability. That is necessary to build the political movements that are going to really be required to affect this, and it's just the right thing to do. These issues are part of the same issue. The lack of sustainability is deeply implicated or deeply part of the justice issues that we face. So we need to address them holistically. And the other thing in thinking about cultural heritage is really this need to go deep. I think we really are a community that can go deep with people on these issues, and that's what's so exciting. So I'm going to, for the rest of this talk, kind of explore some of these ideas in the context of museum activities. Fundamentally, in some big compartments, when I think about museums, the things we can do are we can walk the walk, right? We can get sustainable in our practices. We can get people talking. That's the opportunity, these social spaces, to bring people together and get them talking. We can do research and reinterpret collections. So interpret and reinterpret collections, and inspire imagination. I think this is one of the most critical things, is that we need the imagination to see a different world, to build a different world together. And really, museums are these spaces of imagination, right? And so how do we take these places and really turn them into this imaginative catalyst to work with people, to think about the future and be able to imagine alternatives to the relationships and kinds of modes of behavior that we're involved in today. So I'm just going to go through a few examples from my museum as well as other museums of these kinds of museums doing these different practices. So the first one I was talking about, walk the walk. So mitigate emissions, divestment, decolonization, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all part of the same issues. I think we're going to be a lot more effective if we approach these issues in holistic ways and work on them together. Executing sustainability. So that's really thinking across all of your practices, from stewardship to building, stewardship of collections to building exhibitions, to every part of it, really thinking about what are the new best practices. And then making that visible to our audiences, to visitors, sharing those stories, helping people to see those efforts that are being made. And that could include kind of revealing the things that we've been doing wrong and being really open and hosting those kinds of ethical conversations. I've been really impressed with, in England, the kind of turn that I've seen most predominantly, like the London Natural History Museum declaring a climate emergency. And this kind of forward stance for a museum is bold and helpful. And I think that that's the kind of thing, we could work on, each one of us, working with our museums to take a strong stance like this in our community. This was a picture from the Museum Association meeting in Brighton, England, and there was kind of, when you walked into the conference, this Culture Declares movement was everywhere with these emergency signs, an emergency station. And so while that might feel a little jarring, it was this kind of beautiful, lively and colorful presentation that was asking people to write their feelings and participate and giving resources. And so instead of it feeling scary, the emergency felt like really exciting, like an opportunity to really bring our creative selves to this work. And I want to see this Culture Declares or other ways of doing this movement just spreading all around. It's playful, it's fun, it just lets people, kind of gives a lot of people a way in. One of the things in thinking about exhibition is thinking about, the resources use. And I was proud in the Carnegie Museum of Natural History did an exhibit called We Are Nature, Living in the Anthropocene. And they made an effort in that to the exhibit designers to really use recycled materials, to go to a local this place called Construction Junction and kind of use old things to build the furniture, to build the sets, and really think about sustainability as part of the design. And then we took the materials from that first exhibit and repurposed them to make another exhibit. So this kind of behavior, isn't kind of best practice per se, but we can start to make it best practice. And one thing I'd say with these too is I've noticed that often a museum, when they address an issue like climate change, they'll do the best practices for that one exhibit, but then it's like the next year you're back to just doing the same thing. And so I'd encourage everyone, don't just sort of do it when you're talking about climate change. It has to be part of everything we do, really mainstreaming this whole new set of behaviors. There's a lot of resources out there to help us all come together as a community to do this. This is one example from Museums and Climate Change Network that Jenny Newell, who's here, and others have worked to put together. And there's all kinds of amazing resources in developing this community of practice, right? And helping each other, finding the stories, sharing the methods of how we can do this work together. So the second thing I talked about was this idea of getting people talking. Museums, we can do this inside of our museums, and we can also reach out of our communities and use our kind of our institutional resources to help spur conversation. And one of the reasons I think this is so important is this is a map from the Yale Climate Project that has been doing surveys of people in the United States over years for gosh, I'm not sure how many years, but they asked the same questions over and over for maybe nearly 20 years now. And this is a map that's showing the estimated % of adults who think global warming is happening in 2019. So you see, it's pretty, the red colors, the orange-red colors represent above the 50%. So you can see, actually, the majority of people think global warming is happening. They say so in this poll. But what's interesting is then the next question here, the estimated % of adults who discuss global warming, at least occasionally, see it turns blue, these cooler colors, so less than 50%. And here the average is 36%. So this is really interesting. People are concerned about this, but they're not talking about it. And how can we really work to address a problem if we don't feel comfortable talking about it? So this is a key role that museums can play in communities. And one of the things we've been doing at my museum is really convening people together outside of the museum. We know that there's certain people in the community that don't come to our museum. They don't feel comfortable there, or maybe they're just not interested. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reach them or to work with them. And so this is a learning network. It's called the Climate Urban Systems Partnership. And this is run by our education department and in concert with learning scientists from a local university. And this is building networks to empower other professionals, environmental educators, nonprofit leaders, anyone, civic leaders in the community, to really build their skills and capacity to have climate conversations, to host climate conversations. So they do things like a climate change playground and put together kits and all kinds of things to get out there in the community and build these networks of alliance people. And one of the coolest things about this work is that people often in their organizations feel isolated and alone. They're concerned, but they don't really know how to talk about it. They don't know what to do. And by forging these networks, it allows people to start to feel like, hey, I'm not alone in this. And that builds a lot of efficacy and ability to start working on these problems with more strength. We've expanded this now. We're starting a rural climate systems partnership, working with community partners in the rural area around Pittsburgh, which is western Pennsylvania, where there's is deeply embedded in the fossil fuel industry. And so it's really a different conversation. And we're really learning about how we can work with our communities to understand what's going on and how we can help to facilitate conversations, to bring the science in as is useful, and to build these networks and strengthen people's ability to talk. So we see as a museum, again, we're trying to reach out to have a bigger impact rather than expecting everyone to come to us. A really important part of doing all of this work is to think about the mental health aspects. Climate change is really scary. And I know in my work, I don't often acknowledge that when I give talks. And I've gotten a lot of feedback that we need to talk about this. And there's a lot of psychological research showing this as well, that we need to acknowledge the incredibly intense emotions that people are having and make it safe for people. And or they're really going to turn away from us, which is the last thing we want as we engage with these topics. And so, you know, in the We Are Nature exhibit that I described earlier, an innovative practice, and especially for a science museum, was this exhibit was all about the Anthropocene. But then at the end, you open up into, after getting a lot of kind of content, you know, and object-based interpretation about the impacts of human activities on different parts of the Earth system, it then opened up into a space, an emotional processing space, a participatory space, places for people to do art, to write ideas about how they were feeling. And this was really valuable. People spent more time in the emotional processing area than they did in the actual exhibit. And they told us that this really made it, like it helped them kind of work with their feelings and leave motivated rather than leaving depressed. Although I should say a lot of people left describing themselves as motivated and depressed. And I thought that was really good in a way, because that's authentic, right? You know, if you're just motivated, maybe you didn't quite understand. So I think that this is really valuable. I saw at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, they have an exhibition called Design for the Future. And I saw they had something called a Futures Therapies Lab, where it was an opportunity to talk about these things as part of the exhibit. And I thought these kinds of embedding programming and facilitation into these really complex topics, I think, is an essential part of these practices as we engage with these very difficult issues. On the idea of a kind of broadening who you partner with, what you do. So this is an example of, at the Natural History Museum, a partnership we have with another group called the Natural History Museum, which is an art collective and pop-up who works on really interrogating what natural history is, but they're helping to do a lot of really innovative program. And so we were able to work with them and host a series called Power Beyond Extraction that included bringing in different kind of labor activists and local Appalachia people to talk about their relationship with the land, and to sing songs, mining songs, and share kind of the struggles of the people in both being part of a lot of difficult negative impacts through the long time association with the coal mining industry and fracking today, but their real deep love for the land. And there were some people who said, why is the Natural History Museum hosting this conversation? And I thought, this is exactly the kind of conversations we need to be hosting, because natural history is about living ecologies, and people are a part of that, all people. And so this kind of work to really bring the social justice, to bring diverse communities in, and to partner in new ways is really what we're trying to do, and I think will help build a broader movement. And so this sign behind here says on the stage, you know, be the ancestor that your descendants would be proud of. So a little bit about collections, and so there's, you know, thinking with objects is a big thing we do in museums, and there's incredible opportunities to spin stories with objects and to interpret them from multiple points of view, and these ideas of strong objectivity, right? Really kind of letting go of some of our ideas that there's one expert who can tell us the story, but that there are many experts who can tell stories, and we can use these objects to think together. So this is a book that I was a part of that I share it because it's a neat book to think about really complex, wicked problems and how you tell Anthropocene stories with objects. These are a couple examples from my museum. Here's a story where I'm showing, we're talking about coal and the impacts, and the idea that coal use is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was one theory of when the Anthropocene begins. And here we have birds from our collection that were used in a study where you can actually sample the soot from their bodies, and that was used to create a documentation of a historical record of pollution in cities, Rust Belt cities in the United States. And so these objects or these specimens, these birds, their bodies are these vessels, right, of carrying samples of the environments they were living in. And in this case, you can see these are the same species, but one's belly is quite white, and that's after the Clean Air Act, and one's belly is very gray in the earlier times when there was a lot of soot. So these are really visual ways the public can see the changes. This is another example of using our phenology herbarium specimens to look at changing phenology. And so collection manager and curator in the botany department have collected, they go out and they resample in the exact same place a plant 100 years later, and then compare the phenology, the life cycle of the plants 100 years ago to today. And we can see that basically in our area, plants are about 2 to 3 weeks ahead in their phenology and their life cycle. And what's exciting about this is it provides research, right, empirical evidence of how organisms are responding to changes, but also really visual evidence for people to kind of see it with their own eyes, and it's relevant locally. Another really important way that collections are being used is to document change, and this is an example from the Entomological Society of Krefeld, and they were able to do a resurvey of flying insects in their region in natural parks in Germany, and they found a 75% decline in the biomass of flying insects over the last 30 years. And so these collections, right, provide these opportunities to look at what's really happening. And this is remarkable, a 75% decline of flying insects in protected areas. You know, I don't think anyone was even imagining this. But these collections and the fact that we steward the archives with them, allow us to look across time in really essential ways. This is a quote. Again, I get to promote Jenny Newell's work here, but a book she edited that's really excellent called Curating the Future. And but the quote is from Christine Wiener, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. But this I really love because it's I love the way that this helps us to imagine what we can do with collections. So it says, collections constitute an inheritance, one that embodies older structures of knowledge, but that also holds great potential to disrupt disciplinary boundaries and establish modes of thinking and acting in ways that open up space for new ecological and empathetic understandings. And so this is exactly the kind of thinking of how can we relate to the objects that we have, maybe even think of them not as objects, but as subjects, as things that have a relationship that they've been extracted from. And what kinds of ways can we start to rethink the way we work with the museum to take a more ecological, a more relationship approach, to really think about the way that our previous methods have misguided us to misunderstand our planet and our role in it. So here's an example from Manchester Museum. It's called Youth Adventures, the work of Hannah Lee Chalk, where she did this incredible work with young people, and she used an ecological approach to reimagine the museum and had kids kind of going all over and talking about the relationships and making meaning with the things that they would find, to think about their own lives, making meanings between objects, and just developing a whole ecology of place and making connections between humans and non-humans and problem issues and possible solutions. So I encourage you to look at her work further. And the last thing that I want to talk about is this idea of inspiring imagination, and how we can each in our own institution find our transformative stories or myths that are going to help with this transformation. And so one thing I think a lot about is this kind of idea that's out there in environmental communication, that we've been so focused on the gloom and doom that we need to provide positive stories, right? You make it happy, put a smiley face on it. And I really think that yes, that's true, but we really have to go deeper, because what can happen is we're so eager to find a solution that we're looking at it way too simply, and we're promoting things that really don't come to scale to solve these challenges. And so what can we, so I think this is a specific opportunity or a challenge I would give to the heritage sector is to go deep and to make these connections. Can we be the source of really seeding this cultural transmission, not just solving problems that don't really solve problems at all, right? Because they're unjust, they only work for some people, or they dispossess people. So what are these more transformational stories that we can tell, and what do we really want to look at? And I was thinking about a couple of these. I'm going to tell you about what I'm thinking about at my museum, but before I do, I just briefly wanted to mention this story of the Fatberg Diaries at the Museum of London, because I saw the curators give a really interesting talk about how they engaged with the Fatberg. Is everyone familiar with the Fatberg? No, okay. The Fatberg is, it was basically found in the sewage system of London, and it was this massive amalgamation of like diapers and just human junk that built up so much that the whole sewage system was blocked. And so excavators, right, had to go down and start digging this thing out in order for the sewage system to work again. And as they did, the Museum of London thought, okay, we should participate in this. And so they got a bit of this, this stuff, this amalgamation from the sewer that's just human junk, really, that people are putting down their toilets and their sinks. And they then worked to create a whole exhibit and interpret what this thing was. And it was the most, they said it was the most visitation they'd ever had, the most interest they had in their museum. It created this incredible like frenzy of activity and fascination, and they worked with scientists to sort of study it while it basically started decomposing in the museum exhibit. And so they had to try to, in real time, figure out how can we conserve this thing. And you know, it was this incredible story that people could come together around exploring and at the same time really reflecting on their own waste, right? And the problematic of the stuff is not decomposing, and our systems aren't working. And so they have a blog all about this project, and it's a really neat example of kind of finding your own way in. And in that sense, what I'm thinking about in my museum is really about the story of how we tell natural history. And there's this dominant narrative, which is the struggle of life, right? It's all about competition, predation, survival of the fittest. And if you go to a natural history museum, you will see these words, all the dioramas. It's all about predation, competition, the language, and we're reinforcing this idea of how the world works. This is contributed to this notion that we don't have a place in nature, right? You go around to parks and they tell you, stay out, nature's at work, right? And oh, okay, I'm not a part of it. And we're feeding these ideas everywhere in our cultural landscape and our cultural heritage sites. And I would argue that that's brought us to this place, right? The Anthropocene. This giant, disastrous way of working with the land, of working with non-humans to forge our livelihoods. And so this is a bleak landscape. There's no people in it. And when I think about the Anthropocene, this isn't the story that I want to share. I want to imagine a future where where we think our way out of this predicament. And I think we have those stories. I know we have those stories all around us, but we're not telling them. And we have them, as we heard earlier, from our indigenous stewardship and the wisdom. We have it from science. We are not telling our biology stories. As we learn about DNA, we learn about this radical way in which our own bodies are these incredible ecosystems. We can't digest food without our microbial community. A new idea in biology is that we are holobionts, right? We are a human and our microbial community. That is who we really are. These are the stories this is contemporary biology. This is the knowledge. There's a whole story of cooperation that we haven't been telling, that has been repressed. And much of it comes from feminist scientists as well as indigenous scientists, and we're just not sharing those stories. So part of this project of facing the Anthropocene, of facing climate change, is really opening up where do we have our knowledge, you know, this more deeper sense of telling the multiple stories we have out there, and the stories that are going to serve us, that are true and are going to serve us to get where we want to go. So as I think about natural history, I'm thinking about a symbiotic planet, right? An alternative way of looking at our world and telling these stories. And I wonder what kind of transformation, seed of transformation, might that have with our children, with adults, with everyone, to start to see their place differently and enable this catalyst, this change that we need in society at large to address the Anthropocene. So my question for all of you is kind of, what is your way in? You know, what is your transformational story, and how can you take the work you do and seed these new ideas? So thank you very much.